By the time the winter frost of 1861 settled over a divided continent, the United States of America was living through a wound it had spent the better part of 7 decades pretending it would never have to face. The country was tearing itself in two, not gradually, not theoretically, but with the very real sound of artillery and the very real weight of bodies stacking up in fields that had no business becoming battlegrounds. The Confederate States of America had been in formal existence for less than a year, and yet the war it had sparked had already grown into something far larger than a domestic argument between American factions. Across the Atlantic Ocean, 3,000 miles away in the drawing rooms of Westminster and the warehouses of Liverpool, another war was being fought, a quieter one, fought with ledgers and speeches and carefully worded diplomatic dispatches. And in some ways, this invisible war posed a greater threat to the Union's survival than any Confederate general on any Virginia battlefield. London had declared neutrality in May of 1861. On paper, this sounded reassuring. In practice, it was anything but. British shipyards were quietly entertaining Confederate purchasing agents. British textile mills were running dangerously low on the raw cotton that kept their machinery humming and their workers employed. And in the most powerful circles of British political and commercial life, men of considerable influence were asking a question that nobody was saying out loud, but everybody was thinking. Would it actually be in Britain's best interest if the American Republic simply ceased to exist in its current form? This was not idle speculation. It was policy in early development. Ulysses Grant was not famous in the winter of 1861. He was not even particularly notable. He was a captain who had been restored to the military roles after years of absence, years that polite military society preferred not to examine too closely. He had resigned his commission back in 1854 under circumstances involving alcohol and loneliness at a remote Pacific posting, and the years that followed had been a catalog of quiet failures. Real estate, farming, a job at his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. None of it had worked especially well. He was 39 years old, compact in build and slightly unkempt in appearance, with a beard that perpetually looked as though it was 3 days overdue for attention. The men who served under him and survived to write about it later consistently noted something peculiar about his eyes, a quality of absolute stillness, as though the normal human activity of registering emotion had been replaced with something more functional and considerably more unsettling. He did not give inspirational speeches. He did not draft grand proclamations about destiny or honor or the sacred cause. He smoked cigars with the methodical intensity of a scientist conducting a controlled experiment. And he looked at maps the way a skilled butcher surveys a side of beef, not with any particular emotion, but with a precise professional understanding of exactly where the knife needs to go next. What Grant had understood by the winter of 1861, and while many of his fellow officers were still conducting the war as though it were a formal tournament with rules and scheduled intervals, was something so blunt and unromantic that it barely qualified as strategic theory. He understood that the Confederacy could only outlast the Union if it received meaningful help from a foreign power. And the only foreign power that truly mattered in terms of both naval strength and industrial capacity was Britain. The mechanism of potential British intervention rested entirely on a single agricultural commodity, cotton. By 1860, the American South was supplying somewhere in the vicinity of 75% of all the raw cotton consumed by British textile mills. Those mills, in turn, unemployed roughly 4 million people either directly or indirectly, approximately 1/5 of the entire British population, whose economic lives were quite literally woven into the bales of cotton arriving from Charleston and New Orleans. Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States, was a man of considerable intellectual pride and, as events would demonstrate, limited strategic imagination. He had built his entire foreign policy framework around this single pressure point. The strategy was called cotton diplomacy, and its internal logic was as simple as it was seductive. Cut off the cotton supply, idle the mill workers, threaten the profits of the merchant class, and Britain, faced with mounting unemployment and economic disruption, would have no choice but to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy in order to restore its supply chain. Davis spoke about this strategy with the confidence of a man who has conflated his own wishes with the inevitable direction of history. His Secretary of State, Robert Toombs, shared the same certainty. Together, they had constructed a foreign policy built entirely on the assumption that British commercial self-interest would override every other consideration, political, moral, and strategic. There was a man present at the Galena muster in June of 1861 who would prove, in retrospect, to have understood the flaw in this strategy before it was even fully deployed. His name was Corporal Amos Whitfield, 24 years old, a former clerk from a Cincinnati shipping firm who had spent 2 years maintaining correspondence with cotton brokers in Liverpool. He had enlisted for reasons he never fully explained, and he possessed a habit that made his superiors mildly uncomfortable. He wrote everything down, not orders or drill schedules. Those he filed in the appropriate places. Then everything else. Overheard conversations outside headquarters tents, the shifting mood of men returning from picket duty, the quiet disagreements between officers who assumed they were speaking privately. Whitfield appears in no major history of the Civil War. He was a bureaucratic nobody of the first order, but in his small brown notebook, now held in a private collection in Ohio, he wrote in the autumn of 1861 something that functioned as a clear-eyed summary of the Confederacy's entire strategic miscalculation. The Confederates are betting their nation on the British needing their cotton more than the British need their dignity. I have dealt with Liverpool cotton brokers for 2 years. They are not sentimental men, but they are not suicidal ones either. I wonder if Richmond has confused the two. He had identified the crack in the mechanism before the mechanism had been fully assembled. But he was a corporal in the 21st Illinois Infantry, and nobody was asking him. The British debate over entering the war reached its most precarious point in the autumn and early winter of 1862. Historians studying this period have since identified it as the closest the United Kingdom came to formally recognizing the Confederate States, and potentially entering the conflict as an active belligerent. On September 17, 1862, at a farm near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along a shallow waterway called Antietam Creek, the Union Army of the Potomac under General George McClellan collided with Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in 12 hours of combat so concentrated and so devastating that it produced 22,717 casualties in a single day. Still the bloodiest 24 hours in the entire history of American warfare. The Union held the field. McClellan characteristically declined to pursue the retreating Confederates. But the Confederate invasion of Northern Territory had been stopped. Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for exactly this kind of result. 5 days after Antietam, that on September 22nd, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation did something to the British intervention question that Jefferson Davis had simply never accounted for. It fundamentally reframed what the war was about. Before the proclamation, a cultivated British observer could view the conflict as a constitutional dispute between two American political entities. A disagreement about tariffs, sovereignty, and states' rights in which the Confederacy had a certain underdog appeal. After the proclamation, it was explicitly, inescapably, and publicly a war about slavery. And Britain had abolished slavery throughout its entire empire in 1833. The British working class, the very mill workers whose unemployment Davis had been counting on to generate irresistible political pressure for intervention, held mass meetings in Manchester and Birmingham. They were experiencing genuine economic hardship from the cotton shortage. They were going hungry, and they still publicly declared their support for the Union cause and for Lincoln's emancipation. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable acts of collective moral seriousness in the history of labor movements. And history has never quite given it the recognition it deserves. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, 77 years old, constitutionally cautious, and he possessed of a long political memory that included the War of 1812, began quietly withdrawing from the intervention question. His Foreign Secretary, Lord John Russell, and his Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, who had famously declared at a speech in Newcastle on October 7, 1862, that Jefferson Davis had made a nation, found themselves increasingly isolated within the cabinet. The cabinet met on October 23rd to formally discuss intervention. They decided against it. They never revisited the question with any real seriousness again. Grant, by October 1862, was commanding the District of West Tennessee and was in the early stages of planning what would become the Vicksburg Campaign. a 9-month operation of extraordinary complexity that would ultimately sever the Confederacy along the line of the Mississippi River with the precision of a surgical procedure. He was not, at this moment, consciously preoccupied with Britain. He had an army to deploy and a river to take, but the question of British intervention had not left his thinking entirely. It had simply migrated to a different corner of his mind. The corner where Grant stored problems that were not yet emergencies, but would require immediate and overwhelming action the moment they became one. Those who worked closely with Grant understood that his silences were not empty. They were something closer to the silence of a weapon being loaded. Whitfield, they by this point reassigned to a supply depot near Cairo, Illinois, wrote in November 1862, "The British have blinked, but I do not think Grant is the sort of man who assumes a blinked eye is a closed one. He was not wrong." And what Grant had already been quietly considering, with the same cold professional clarity he applied to every operational problem, was a response to any British intervention so geometrically simple and so strategically devastating that it would have permanently redrawn the map of the entire North American continent. If Britain entered the war, Grant did not plan to fight the Royal Navy in the Atlantic Ocean. He planned to march north, into Canada. The idea of invading British North America was not an improvised fantasy born from too many late-night cigars and too little sleep. It had deep historical roots, a precise geographic logic, and a cold commercial rationale that made it, in Grant's professional assessment, not merely possible, but effectively obvious. The United States had attempted to invade Canada twice before, in 1775 during the Revolutionary War and again in 1812. And both attempts had failed, with a thoroughness that military historians found instructive and American nationalists preferred not to dwell on. Grant was fully aware of both failures. He was also aware of something that neither of those earlier expeditions had possessed: a battle-hardened Continental Army that had been engaged in continuous warfare for 2 years and was demonstrably improving with every campaign it conducted. The border between the United States and British North America stretched approximately 5,525 miles from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. The militarily relevant portion, the section that could actually be reached, supplied, and contested by land forces operating from existing Union positions, ran roughly 1,200 miles from the St. Lawrence River Valley to the western Great Lakes. Canada's total population in 1862, it was approximately 3.2 million people. The Union Army, as of January 1863, had 918,121 men present for duty. The British regular garrison defending Canada at that same moment consisted of fewer than 18,000 soldiers, distributed across fortifications whose most recent serious upgrade had been completed in the 1840s. The arithmetic was not complicated, but what made the arithmetic genuinely brutal, rather than merely unfavorable to Britain, was the question of supply and reinforcement. The Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force on the planet, somewhere in the vicinity of 700 vessels of varying class and capability. But naval supremacy in the Atlantic did not translate into the rapid deployment of large ground forces across 3,000 miles of ocean, particularly during winter months, when the St. Lawrence River froze solid and the overland route through New Brunswick became a logistical nightmare of frozen roads and inadequate infrastructure. And Britain could reinforce Canada, but not quickly, and Grant could reach Montreal faster than London could reinforce it. That was the essential geometry of the entire problem, and it was a geometry that Grant had internalized completely. Whitfield was transferred in February 1863 to a quartermaster position attached directly to Grant's command, as the Vicksburg campaign entered its most complex operational phase. He had been promoted to sergeant, less for battlefield distinction than for an administrative precision his superiors found simultaneously indispensable and mildly unnerving. He processed requisitions, tracked supply shipments, maintained the meticulous logistical records that separated an army that could actually move from an army that could only generate paperwork about why it couldn't. And he was still watching, still writing. What he observed in the spring of 1863 was not Grant discussing the Canada question directly. Grant rarely discussed anything directly if a pause or a nod would accomplish the same purpose. What Whitfield noticed was the way certain categories of contingency planning were handled by Grant's staff. There were maps, not only of Mississippi and Louisiana, but of Ontario, of Quebec, of the rail lines running from Toronto to Montreal, of the fortifications at Quebec City, all which were formidable on their southern face and considerably less so on their western approaches. Whitefield noted in April 1863, "Nobody asked me to file the Ontario surveys. I filed them anyway. They are current. Someone ordered them current." He did not speculate further. He did not need to. The actual British strategic calculation, stripped of diplomatic language and sentiment, looked like this in the spring of 1863. On one side of the scale, the Confederacy, if recognized and actively supported, offered Britain the eventual restoration of its cotton supply. The timeline was uncertain. The Confederate military position was becoming less and less encouraging by the month, and the political cost of openly allying with a slaveholding republic against a union that had just proclaimed emancipation was climbing toward levels that even the most commercially motivated cabinet minister found deeply uncomfortable. On the other side of the scale, intervention placed the following concrete liabilities into British hands: the near certain seizure of British merchant vessels currently operating in American waters, the probable confiscation of British financial investments in Union states, estimated at roughly £80 million in railroad bonds and related instruments, but the activation of the Alabama Claims Framework that American diplomats had been quietly constructing ever since Confederate commerce raiders built in British shipyards began systematically destroying Union merchant shipping, and, most concretely and most catastrophically, Canada. Canada was not merely a colonial outpost in 1862. It was the single largest territorial possession in the Western Hemisphere belonging to the British Empire. Its some 3.8 million square miles of land, containing substantial agricultural production, significant timber resources, and a growing industrial base anchored in Montreal, Toronto, and Hamilton. And it was, in purely military terms, indefensible against a Union army operating at full capacity from positions along its entire southern border. One of Palmerston's own military advisors put it plainly in a private memorandum dated November 1862. A now preserved in the British public records, defending Canada against a Union invasion without Great Lakes naval superiority was like trying to protect a greenhouse with one hand while someone held a sledgehammer against the glass. You could attempt it. The outcome was predetermined regardless. Grant understood this. More importantly, and this was the genuinely subtle part of his strategic thinking, Grant understood that the British understood this. His entire conception of how America should respond to British intervention was built not on the assumption that invading Canada would actually be necessary, but on the assumption that if the intention were made sufficiently clear, not as bluster or diplomatic posturing, but as the straightforward operational plan of a general who had already demonstrated, repeatedly and at great cost to his enemies, that he meant exactly what he implied, then it would never need to be executed at all. That the threat was the policy. The invasion plan was the argument, and the argument in this case was being made not through diplomatic channels, but through the quiet ordering of updated surveys and the discreet maintenance of contingency maps. On May 22, 1863, Grant's forces launched a full-scale assault on the Vicksburg defensive lines. It failed, producing 3,199 Union casualties in a single afternoon. Grant immediately converted to siege operations. By June 3rd, the Confederate garrison of approximately 29,500 men under Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton was completely encircled. The siege lines extended for 12 miles. Grant had 71,000 men and a reliable supply line. Pemberton had neither. The mathematics of starvation were as straightforward as the mathematics of the Canadian border. In London, the Vicksburg siege was being observed with close and anxious attention. A Confederate victory there, the breaking of the siege, and the relief of Pemberton's garrison, the retention of the Mississippi River as a Confederate artery, would have reopened the intervention question with renewed force. A Confederate defeat would likely close it permanently. The British waited. They had been waiting since October 1862, and the waiting had gradually assumed the character of a policy in itself. Whitefield wrote in June 1863, 3 weeks into the siege, "I have been calculating supply tonnage for the siege works. Yes, the numbers are not the interesting part. The interesting part is that Grant has already calculated what happens after Vicksburg falls, and the answer to that calculation is not in Mississippi. He paused, then added a single line. The Ontario maps are still current. Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th, 1863. Pemberton's 29,500 men laid down their weapons at 10 in the morning in the Mississippi summer heat. 91 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity absolute, and the smell of 30,000 men who had been surviving on half rations for 6 weeks, registering as a physical presence in the air. On that same day, 300 miles to the northeast, Robert E. Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg. The Confederacy would continue fighting for nearly 2 more years, but the twin catastrophes of July 4th ended, permanently and without any formal announcement. Every realistic prospect of British intervention on its behalf. Yet Palmerston's government had been waiting for Confederate military success, sufficient to justify the political cost of recognition. After July 4th, 1863, such success was no longer a plausible expectation. The question quietly ceased to exist as live policy and began its long transformation into a historical footnote that British diplomatic history would spend the following century carefully minimizing. Jefferson Davis received the news of Vicksburg's fall on July 7th, 3 days after the event. But he was 55 years old, nearly blind in his left eye from a worsening medical condition, and possessed of a dignity so absolute and so rigid that his subordinates sometimes mistook it for genuine strength. It was not strength. It was the load-bearing architecture that a man constructs when the foundation beneath him has already begun to give way. He read the dispatch, set it down on his desk with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not wish to be observed trembling. He sat in silence for approximately 90 seconds, then dictated 3 letters on unrelated administrative topics and went to dinner. He did not, in any surviving document, directly acknowledge what Vicksburg meant for the British intervention question. He did not need to. The British had already acknowledged it for him. Grant, at Vicksburg that same July 4th, and accepted the surrender with no theatrical gestures and no visible satisfaction beyond the functional acknowledgement that the objective had been achieved and the next objective now required attention. He paroled Pemberton's garrison rather than shipping them north to prison camps, partly logistical, partly the calculation of a man who understood that 30,000 additional hungry mouths constituted a liability, not an asset. That evening he wrote to his wife Julia, covering domestic matters, the children's health, his likely next assignment, and approximately 2 sentences on the fall of Vicksburg. He did not mention Britain, he did not mention Canada, he did not mention the Ontario surveys or the contingency planning. The plan had served its purpose by never being needed, which meant it had served its purpose entirely invisibly, and invisible victories leave no correspondence. And Amos Whitfield was present at the surrender, not at the ceremony itself, but in a requisitioned warehouse 400 yards from the riverfront, processing parole documents and supply manifests. He heard the distinctive quiet that replaced the sound of active siege operations, a silence that was its own kind of noise, and stepped outside for about 10 minutes. He stood and looked at the river. What he picked up from the ground outside that warehouse, that and what he kept for the remaining 41 years of his life, was a single brass button. Confederate manufacture, infantry pattern, stamped with the letter C surmounted by a block Y, the insignia of Confederate infantry, recovered from the mud outside a warehouse in Vicksburg, Mississippi on the morning of July 4th, 1863. Whitfield wrote about it in 1897 in a brief memoir composed for his grandchildren and never published. I kept it because it seemed like the actual size of the thing. Not the speeches, not the campaigns, not the maps of Ontario that I filed and never spoke of to anyone, just a button. The Confederacy had bet on British mills needing their cotton more than the British needed their Canada. They lost that bet before the first shot was fired. The button was what was left. Grant articulated the full strategic logic only in retrospect, in his personal memoirs, published in 1885, the year of his death from throat cancer, written in a desperate race against a terminal illness that produced one of the finest military autobiographies ever written in the English language. The relevant passage is characteristically spare, stripped of ornamentation, carrying the quiet weight of a man who has thought about something for 20 years and reduced it to its essential form. Had England intervened, the United States would have put into the field an army that had been hardened by war, and Canada would inevitably have become part of the United States. He did not say this with anger or with pride. He said it the way you describe the trajectory of a billiard ball after the cue has made contact, as a geometric observation about what would have happened, given the forces in play. Not a threat, not a boast, a statement of professional fact. The personal memoirs were completed 4 days before Grant died, on July 23, 1885, at a cottage on Mount McGregor in upstate New York. Eli had spent months in continuous pain, unable to swallow, communicating largely through written notes in his final weeks, sustained by cocaine throat swabs and the absolute determination to finish the manuscript before the cancer did. He finished it. The book sold 300,000 copies in its first year, rescuing his family from the financial devastation that a Wall Street fraud had visited upon them 2 years earlier. Mark Twain, who published it, that called it the finest military memoir since Caesar's Gallic Wars. That assessment has not been substantially revised. Jefferson Davis published his own memoir, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, in 1881. It runs to 1,500 pages. It does not contain a satisfactory explanation of why cotton diplomacy failed. It contains instead a sustained argument that the Confederacy had been betrayed by its generals, its politicians, and the random contingencies of individual battles, by everything, in short, except the foundational strategic miscalculation that had structured its entire foreign policy from the first months of the conflict. Davis died in 1889, still unreconciled, still constructing the architectural substitute for a dignity that had nowhere left to stand. The macro lesson, reduced to its structural core, is this. Confederate cotton diplomacy failed not because British commercial interests were indifferent to the cotton supply, but because British strategic interests were acutely and mortally sensitive to the Canadian exposure. Both pressures existed simultaneously, and the British government, whatever its private sympathies or commercial anxieties, could not resolve the tension in the Confederacy's favor without accepting a military liability that no responsible government could rationally accept. Grant's plan, the invasion of Canada as the immediate Union response to British intervention, was never formally announced. It was never delivered as a diplomatic ultimatum. It was never committed to paper in any document bearing his signature that has survived. It existed as operational preparation, as updated surveys, as current maps. It as the known and demonstrated capability of an army whose commander had shown, at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, at Vicksburg, that he converted operational plans into executed reality with a consistency that his enemies found, in retrospect, profoundly clarifying. The threat did not need to be spoken to be effective. It needed only to be real, and it was real in the most concrete possible sense. 918,000 Union soldiers present for duty, a 1,200-mile border, 18,000 British regulars in garrison, and a general who looked at maps the way a butcher looks at a carcass. The Ontario surveys, wherever they went after the war, have never been located. Perhaps they were destroyed. Perhaps they sit uncatalogued in some archive box waiting to be found. Perhaps, having served their purpose, they were simply discarded as operational documents for a contingency that never became an operation. A plan for a war that was won by the entirely credible threat of fighting it. History is full of such absences. The weapons never fired, the orders never issued, the invasions that shaped the world by remaining permanently and decisively on their shelves. Which leaves a question worth sitting with. If Grant's Canada Plan was the hidden structural foundation of Union diplomatic security during the most dangerous years of the Civil War, a deterrent that functioned precisely because it was real and because it was largely unspoken, then what equivalent plans exist today? I filed in the archives of governments that have learned the same lesson, shaping the world through the credible threat of their execution, visible only to the historians who come after, and who know where to look for the Ontario surveys.